All right, so thank you, Kelly. And like Kelly mentioned, we'll open the floor now for public comments. I'm gonna go over the kind of rules and how we're gonna make this work again. So to provide verbal comments, you can go ahead and click raise hand to be placed in the speaker queue. When it's your turn, I'll call your name and invite you to unmute yourself. Please remember to introduce yourself with your name and your organization. If we have telephone callers, please feel free to also chime in. You can press *9 to raise your hand and *6 to unmute when prompted. In addition, to submit a question, type your question into the Q&A box at any point. We will try to answer all the questions in the Q&A box, either live or typed in the answer box there. If you see a question that you think is important, please click the thumbs up button under the question to bump it up to the top. And because we have limited time, we will likely be limiting verbal comments to 3 minutes or so. As I say that, though, I'm realizing we've only got a couple hands up. So if you do need a little bit more time, that's probably okay. But remember that you can also email us your comments at storms@waterboards.ca.gov. One more reminder of our general comment ground rules. This is a public discussion, not a debate. We'd like to hear and respect the perspectives and ideas that are shared today. Like everybody to listen actively and with an open mind. We can better understand everyone's perspectives when we try and see things through others' eyes. You can respect another person's point of view without necessarily agreeing with them. And lastly, stay on point and on time. We're talking about the infiltration policy or the proposed infiltration policy. So please keep to that discussion. If you have more things to say, again, please feel free to email us. We'd be happy to read your comments. So I'm going to go ahead and let's see. We've got some Q&A here. And I will start with that. So here we've got one question that says, my NGO, Clean Water Now, is in South Orange County. Our concern is that aggressive tactics might adversely affect base flow regimes, i.e. rob what native species we have left to stream moisture content year round. Basically extirpating protected species. And yeah, I hear that. Our goal is to not reduce stream flows. Our goal is to manage the stormwater that is kind of extra to those base flows. We don't want to, I mean, one of the things that we're thinking about is environmental flows and maintaining those minimum environmental flows to protect those protected species. Um, I'm sorry, Kelly, do you have anything to add to that? I just went ahead and answered it.
Um, yeah, I agree with what you said. And I think when we talk about specifically the urban stormwater runoff, that's kind of the stuff that we want to capture and not have going into the streams because there are some low-level contaminants that could actually be harmful to aquatic species. So it is a separate water source from like base flow that you would find in a stream.
Yeah. Thank you, Kelly. Okay, MS4 permit, post-construction requirements encourage, sometimes with strong incentives, capture and infiltration or use of stormwater in lieu of other types of flow-through treatment control BMPs. It appears that this policy does not apply to those permit elements. Can you clarify? I'm sorry, and maybe we need some clarification from Richard on this. Richard, uh, so this policy will not apply to flow through treatment control BMPs. This policy will apply only to infiltration BMPs. Is that what you were asking? Um, we might need to allow Richard to speak here. Sorry.
Hello.
Oh, hi.
Oh, my phone just rang. Sorry about that. Um, no, actually, I was talking about the infiltration BMPs on small projects that are part of MS4 permit requirements. Priority development projects, which would be relatively small projects compared to, say, some of the things you're envisioning, like regional infiltration systems. And if this policy would apply to those as well to become part of MS4 permits.
Yes. So we do anticipate this policy being implemented through MS4 permits. So it likely would apply to those, depending on the size of the infiltration system. All right, and let's do one more Q&A before we get to the folks with their hands up. I am from unincorporated Mendocino County. I see several of our cities listed in the urban area list, but not the county. Is the county not subject to this? So we're still working on kind of developing exactly what areas the policy would apply to and wouldn't apply to. Right now, like I said before, we're evaluating putting this policy into effect through municipal stormwater permits, which generally apply to urban areas. So I think kind of rural areas in the county might not be subject to this. But I can't give you a firm yes or no yet. But at this point, we're thinking that this is only going to apply to urban areas. All right, so we've got a couple folks with their hands up.
I
We
think Jim Whalen was the first one with his hand up, so I'll let him pipe in.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Jim, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for doing this. Um, is there a camera you turn on here, or is it just the way it is?
I think you don't get to turn on your camera. I'm sorry.
That's all right. I'm less dressed up now. Um, I was on the planning commission in San Diego for over 8 years and tried and failed to get multiple benefit use of stormwater, including infiltration of the groundwater. We had local support conceptually, but the EPA's policy is to have multiple benefit use of stormwater, including such things as wetland habitat, restoration, groundwater recharge, flood control, and of course, stormwater cleaning. We can't do it. And it just hasn't worked. And I'm going to put that on your table to see maybe you can provide some statewide oversight for that assistance. Some of our environmental community calls it double dipping, when one of the ways to pay for this is to sell, say, wetland mitigation credits and stormwater credits. Two different functions. We haven't been able to do that. And another complication, which I would hope we could deal with, is the costliness. So many studies, so much time to get permits. It just takes too long for most people who aren't in this business to want to do it. We have a very large project where we're going to be doing it. It's a 3,000 unit project for a client of ours. And there we are. But it's been challenging because it takes that side of kind of scale to make this thing happen. And then a last thing I would throw out there is just to think about no live stream discharge. And we need that because our groundwater basins suck. We only have like 5 of them. And the rest of it is okay, see what you can do to improve natural systems. And I would argue in response to concerns about people of flowing streams is our streams are supposed to be dry part of the year. That's the way it's supposed to be here, but it's not that way. Urban slobber makes them wet, especially in the urbanized areas, all year round. So my hope is that this program would help address that, so we get more of a periodicity instead of this constant, it's flows all the time. Even now, when we haven't had one rainfall, we had one rainfall in 8 months. So I really admire you're doing this. I hear you're stealing somebody from San Diego to help run the program, and I'm going to keep an eye on both of you to make sure you don't work her to death.
We're not
Yeah.
stealing her. She's just helping out.
Okay. I look forward to more. Thank you.
Great, thank you for your comments, Jim. I appreciate it. Yeah, you bring up really good points, and we'll be exploring all of those that you suggested. I know stormwater infrastructure is extremely expensive, and we certainly don't want to add any burdens and any more expense to this. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is to like make it easier to do infiltration when that's the right thing to do.
One way that would help is to come up with metrics. We use acres for habitat restoration. I propose flow for this, and then you can charge. You have to figure out how can you charge for it. And then to your maintenance question, we require that. I would propose the same system we use for habitat management, which is endowments or community facilities districts. Those are good ways to pay for these things too.
Great.
Sorry, I'll talk to you less.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you, Jim. All right, David, who do we have next?
Ash Parenthaman, I believe.
Oh, great, thanks. If you want to go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thanks, Amanda and Kelly, for this presentation. Great presentation. I'm from Rick Engineering here in San Diego, and I have two questions. First question is, how are you coming up with the minimum setbacks, both vertical and horizontal? And then another question I have is, in San Diego, we don't have good infiltration rates. And most of the times, we have biofiltration BMPs for priority projects, priority development projects. And rarely, in rare circumstances, we do have partial infiltration BMPs. So would these apply to partial infiltration BMPs as well, or is this just for, full infiltration BMPs?
That's a great question. Kelly, do you want to take both of those?
Good question. Sure. So I'll start with the setbacks one, because that was something that we spent a lot of time looking into. So we've done a comprehensive literature survey of all existing stormwater manuals and literature we could find that cited setbacks and reasons for them. And we also tried to investigate any primary sources associated with those. And so unfortunately, there isn't a lot of really great modeling and data, but we did our best to kind of do a full survey of just existing standards and make our best initial concept of where we'd want a starting point for minimum setbacks to be based on all the available literature and manuals and design manuals that we could find. And that's across the US, other countries. So that's where we got our setbacks from. And then yeah, the partial infiltration question is a good one. I know that, or I don't envision us trying to micromanage like very small incidental volumes of infiltration. And another thing to consider too is if that infiltration is happening in a low risk land use type, we want to encourage that, right? So I don't know to what extent they would be subject to the policy. It would probably depend on the volume and the size of the system and kind of what's going on as far as land use types, I would think. But that is a good question. Something to think about.
For the setbacks, the different municipalities have, different setback requirements when it comes to infiltration. So would this policy trump all of that, or would the local municipalities still get to dictate, like additional requirements? Would this be like the minimum?
I think so far we're thinking of it as a minimum starting point, and then like I was trying to specify in the presentation, if like there's other better engineering analyses for localized kind of subsurface conditions that are going to differ from those setbacks, that would be totally acceptable as well. But if that's not available, then we want some minimum standard in place. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And then for the partial infiltration, it would be good to have in the guidance clear definition where these policies apply, right? Like partial infiltration is one of those categories that's kind of in the gray area. And if we can also have some land use definitions, hey, if you're doing these BMPs in single family residential areas, maybe you don't need to worry about this. Maybe there's a acre foot limit, right? If you're infiltrating more than a certain amount of acre foot, then you need to start looking into this. So hopefully, there are these, like clear definitions in the guidance. Yeah.
Yeah, there definitely will be. Yeah,
Thank
thank you
you.
for that input.
Thank you. Before we go on to the next person with their hand up, there's a couple questions in the chat that I'd like to kind of address before we move on. So there's one here at the top from David Swartz. Infiltration is a compliance option for the industrial general permit and the draft CII permit, that's commercial institutional industrial permit. You did say that you'd be working with IGP reissuance team at least. Do you foresee either or both of these permits becoming more restrictive regarding infiltration as a result of the draft policy? And then I'm also going to add on to that. Oh, it's also by the same person. The IGP at least requires infiltrated stormwater to meet secondary drinking water maximum contaminant levels. Are you considering the policy including monitoring, and would there potentially be need to meet secondary MCLs? So one of the reasons why we're doing this policy is to kind of clear up that confusion that was started when the IGP was reissued the last time. And I think we got to a point where we didn't quite know what to do with talking about infiltration in the IGP. And so we said, okay, it has to meet MCLs or secondary MCLs. Our goal with this policy is to make it easier to do infiltration on industrial sites where it's appropriate. I'd like to say that again, where it's appropriate. If there's Thankfully, we don't have PFAS factories here in California, but if we did, we wouldn't want them to necessarily be be putting all of that water into the ground. But we're working with the industrial general permit team to see how we can make it kind of more reasonable, depending on the type of industry, depending on the type of contaminants that might be present, depending on the housekeeping, what the area looks like, how close they are to other hydrogeologic, if they're connected to streams. So it's a number of things that we're kind of exploring. But we would like to make it so that we can have more infiltration. This is really what the policy is pushing. Like, we really want to see, like, how can we get more water into the ground and save it for future uses, right? Eventually. So hopefully I answered that. Oh, then the CII permit, that I don't know about that one. We haven't been as involved with the CII permit because it is just for those two basins in Los Angeles. I know there's talk of potentially one day making a statewide CII permit. And in that case, that will come after this policy comes into play, and hopefully it will have the same flexibility as the IGP permit. All right, and with that, let's move back to folks with their hands up. David, who do we have next?
Barbara Washburn.
Excellent. Hey, Barbara, you want to go ahead and unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you. My name is Barbara Washburn. I'm with the Slough House Resource Conservation District. We're one of the groundwater sustainability agencies in the Cosumnes Basin. And you mentioned before that in some of your presentation, earlier in the presentation of your literature, that you're trying to develop a standardized system to overcome some of the obstacles associated with local jurisdictions' reluctance to allow for infiltration. In our groundwater basin, we are looking at infiltration as one of the major ways to help overcome our overdraft. And I'm sure you're aware that, down south of us here in the San Joaquin Valley, there is an even greater need because their overdraft is much more significant, to implement infiltration practices. So dry wells are a great option. We built one here in a test one, a research dry well we've constructed here in the basin, but we can't do anything else because we're stymied by the county. They don't want anything to do with it until you folks at the water board adopt a policy. So I say I'll go through this long story just so you appreciate the importance of applying this policy to rural areas. I mean, the principles are the same, whether you're in an urban area or a rural area with infiltration. And so I really hope you folks will consider that issue, applying these principles and your guidance to rural areas. And I'd be interested in any comments either of you might have. Thank you.
Yeah, Barbara, we are familiar with your research and we've cited you a number of times already. So thank you so much for showing up to this and giving your input. It's a good point, and it's something honestly that we hadn't quite considered yet is the need for guidance, infiltration guidance in rural areas. I think we're going to have to think about that and figure out a way to get that into the policy because, yeah, I know that Sacramento County right now isn't allowing any dry wells. And you're right, in rural areas that's needed. And if folks can't get the water in the ground, then that's a problem. So I don't know, Kelly, do you have any thoughts? Or we can just add this to the list of things we need to talk about and consider. And thank you for that, Barbara.
Yeah, I just might say one thing real quick, Amanda, that down in certain areas, they have large farms, hundreds and hundreds of acres where they can do flood mar, as you noted in the early slide. But in some other specific situations, more focused, where the geographical, the opportunity in terms of the land use is more limited, dry wells could be a very useful tool, but we can't use them. So I'm just saying it's not necessarily that all of these rural areas have a need for this, but many of them I think do. And I would be happy to meet with you folks on the side or have a phone call, whatever, if I could be of any assistance. Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara.
Yeah, we'll give you a call for sure. Thank you. Do we want to take another person with their hand up? Is Scott Miller, it looks like. Is that right, David?
Yep.
All right. Scott, if you want to.
Hi there.
Hello.
Hi. Hey, this is Scott Miller. I'm a process engineer with Black and Veatch in the San Francisco area. First off, I want to say I'm very excited that your policy is being developed. It's going to address a big regulatory gray area that I'm asked about pretty often by folks, and it's hard to give a straightforward answer, especially when you work across the entire state. So I have a question about the regulatory review process, especially given that these infiltration projects could adversely impact drinking water sources. So the question is, what regulatory agencies will be involved in the review of these projects under your policy, and for what purpose and at what stages? And will a transparent review workflow be prepared to share with the public so that we can understand who is involved at each stage and why are they involved? And so just a useful analog for this question is that for recycled water projects, the regional board issues the discharge permits, but the Division of Drinking Water is deeply embedded in the review, where they review the Title 22 engineering report from the perspective of human exposure or protecting drinking water supplies. So just given that the water boards, has different jurisdictions, stormwater is an interesting one where the nexus of different expertises are pretty important, but sometimes that trade-off with different agencies working with each other can actually be an obstacle or a reason for delay or a reason for confusion. So just curious about what your thoughts are about how to overcome those confusions and make for a very transparent process. But thanks for your work.
Yeah, that's a great question, Scott. So just to clarify, are you talking about like the state board working with all these different other regulatory agencies during development of the policy, or during implementation of specific projects after the
Oh,
policy?
during the implementation of the projects.
Yeah, so that's a that's a tough question. The former was an easy question. So we are just, I guess, to put it out there, we are working with the Division of Drinking Water very closely. We have a executive on our is one of our executive sponsors for this project. So they're aware of what we're doing. We're working with DTSC as well as our kind of site cleanup folks to make sure, you know, we're protecting groundwater. Our attorney that we have on the project is very familiar with anti-degradation and groundwater policy. So we are thinking about that very closely. And then also, you know, we have plans to kind of reach out to Fish and Wildlife to talk about the environmental flows questions that's come up a couple times. As far as for individual projects, I think that's something that we're going to have to explore as to how we can potentially streamline implementing these projects without having to get kind of approval from every agency. So yeah, I'm we're going to have to take that into consideration, and as we develop this project, we'll keep you posted. But yeah, that's certainly a really good point.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's knowingly complicated, and I just know that this is a really big problem for complex projects is when there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen. So appreciate the thought there.
Yeah. Great, thank you. All right, so it looks like we've got everybody with their hands up. So I'm going to go back to the Q&A here. From James Downing, we have, in addition to water quality constraints, is water quantity being considered? What policy recommendations are being considered for areas where groundwater is very shallow? Uncontrolled infiltration in such areas can sometimes cause localized flooding. Kelly, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So I think, yeah, I guess is water quantity being considered? I'm not totally clear if that refers to like the quantity going into the system or I don't know if James could clarify that a little bit, but as far as the recommendations where groundwater is very shallow, so this policy is going to have generalized guidelines. We're going to have a vertical setback to groundwater aquifers. And then like when these projects are developed, there's going to be like engineering work and reports done on the specific project to ensure that we don't have localized flooding. So the policy isn't going to specify every single criteria for specific projects because that needs to be done by engineers and there needs to be technical work involved. So that's kind of outside, like we don't want to specify every single engineering constraint in a statewide policy. So that'll be more in like the design phase.
Yeah, I guess my intention with that comment was really to try and encourage coordination with the local groundwater management agencies so that those kinds of problems could be avoided. I know that in my area we have, which is the Santa Clara Valley in the South San Francisco Bay area, we have a really complicated geology, and we have a shallow groundwater aquifer and we have a deep water aquifer with an aquitard between, and in places infiltration can be challenging for all kinds of reasons. So to kind of avoid those kinds of problems, I just would recommend that a general recommendation would be to close coordination with the local groundwater management agency.
Yeah, thank you for that, James. I think that's we would like to have more coordination with the local groundwater management agencies. And yeah, it's a good point. Infiltration, we're promoting this as much as possible, but it's not always the best solution in every area. And so, like you said, it really depends on the geology. It depends on how much the ground can actually absorb right before it starts flooding. And so I'm not sure that I can't promise that our policy is actually going to address that. We're really concerned with water quality. But it's certainly something that engineers should be evaluating when they're putting in that infiltration system. And so maybe we can put something in there, some suggestions.
Yeah, well, those sorts of those I will be candid and say that those situations are rare, but when they do arise, they create water quality issues.
True.
So I think it's probably important not to lose sight of them.
Yeah. Thank you, James. We'll write that down. All right, going back to the Q&A. Who determines what those flows should be? Our officials haven't determined these regimes, so there's no baseline. I'm assuming we're talking about environmental flows again in streams. That's something that Fish and Wildlife deals with, and it's not really kind of so much in what we do. Yeah, I'd say Fish and Wildlife, depending on the species that are present in the streams, as well as kind of historical factors. This is way out of my wheelhouse. Kelly, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, that is pretty tangential to the policy. So we're really we're not trying to impact environmental flows with urban stormwater infiltration. And yeah, that's more of a wildlife agency situation. So I'd say that's a little out of scope.
Okay, we've got a question here. I would appreciate feedback on how this policy compares with or is being considered implemented in other states. We have looked at a whole bunch of other states and even countries' implementation of projects like this. I'm not sure we have time tonight to discuss all of them. Kelly, are there any that stand out to you that you could maybe, I know Oregon's got some interesting things that we're trying to copy or pull from. Anyone else we're looking at there?
We're definitely looking at Oregon and Washington, and they have very different sort of regulatory and water rights landscape than we do, but we can still learn from some of the ways that they implement projects. And so we are considering and surveying what other states are doing, but we still have to work within our California regulatory framework as best we can. So we can try and learn as much as we can from other states and then apply that to our systems here.
Thanks, Kelly. All right, we have a question from Lainey Nelson. Will there be a policy to help folks retrofit current BMPs that can be enhanced to hold and infiltrate more water with technology rather than having to build expensive new infrastructure? Retrofit, I mean, I think retrofitting existing systems, if it's cheaper and easier, would be the way to go. It's not really part of our policy at this point, but yeah, I don't think it really fits into the policy at this point. Kelly?
Yeah, that is sort of yeah, it doesn't really fit into the policy at this point. I mean, that's always an option for folks as they're developing projects to retrofit something, and then they would need to meet the policy requirements for that. But yeah, our our policy isn't going to dictate when people can retrofit versus build a new system or anything like that.
All right. Okay. Okay, we have a question. I have reviewed and or worked on hundreds of infiltration projects. If this policy triggers more liability or exposure to liability to property owners, we will see a reduction in using these BMPs. This policy can be detrimental. Thank you for your comment. We're hopeful that this policy will not trigger more liability or exposure to liability. We're actually seeing a lot of people that aren't putting in infiltration systems right now because they are concerned about their liability or exposure to liability because there aren't any regulations surrounding it. There's nothing that's clear. It's very kind of only, I don't know, it's no one really knows when it's okay to do infiltration and when it's not. And so we're hoping that it makes it more clear and not to trigger more liability, but we will certainly consider that as we move forward. Next question here. It feels like a massive assumption that infiltration will contribute to groundwater supply. Many urban lands are vertically disconnected from groundwater supply aquifers. To support water supplies, wouldn't the place to look be in the agricultural and forested landscapes? And do we really want to be capturing low quality urban runoff? Wouldn't a better approach be to capture water for local use, landscaping and gray water? Yeah, you bring up a lot of good points there, Michael. It is stormwater represents a small percentage of the water that's available, and you're right, it is often disconnected from groundwater supply aquifers. I feel like at this point, we're in a period of trying to increase our local water resiliency, and so as much water that we can get to local aquifers, the better. I think calling it low quality urban runoff is a slight misnomer, but I understand what you're saying. And I think, a better approach to be capturing water for local use, like landscaping and gray water, that's also something that we're looking at. I don't think it's an either or sort of thing. I think it's a yes and kind of thing. So in areas where you can't necessarily do infiltration or where you do want to use water right away, that is something that the water board is exploring. So I'm going to say yes to all of that, and we also want to support infiltration as much as possible. Richard Heyman, the requirement in the IGP to pre-treat to meet MCLs does hamstring some areas where infiltration should be feasible, given the subsurface soil's ability to absorb and prevent the migration of pollutants to groundwater and depth of groundwater or other geological factors affecting fate and transport of the Verozone. It would be useful if the policy empowers local permitting authorities to use site-specific studies to evaluate infiltration's impact to groundwater without prescriptively requiring the MCLs be met prior to infiltration. Yes. We absolutely agree and plan to have that as one of the options in our policy, that if local permitting authorities or if the permittee can show that it's not affecting groundwater, then yeah, absolutely, we would love to support that infiltration. All right. Will the local groundwater agency also be part of the review process to ensure safety of their drinking water management system? Kelly, do you want to take that, or do you want me to?
I mean, that's kind of for implementing specific projects, and is that something we would address at the policy? I mean, we could encourage it from a policy level. Like we would love to encourage more cooperation between local groundwater management agencies and both, potable reuse or like any kind of water reuse or capture system. I don't know if that's something we can prescribe with the policy.
Yeah, I think we'll we'll take that into consideration and think about how we can kind of encourage the review process to get the local groundwater agencies involved. Jim, thank you for the offer to assist us with outreach to other agencies. We will take you up on that. Richard Heyman, will the policy touch on what party will have the rights to the water that is captured and infiltrated, or will it remain silent on the topic? We are not involved in water rights. Once the water goes down into the groundwater, it's a groundwater aquifer that is outside the scope of our policy. Jim Rasmus, hello. Can we briefly describe how this will work with EPA's existing underground injection criteria? Kelly, can you give a quick background on why, or I guess maybe the UIC?
Sure. So the US EPA does still have technically authority over what they classify as stormwater underground injection control. So like a dry well would be a good example of that. However, mostly their requirement is just that you need to self-register your system with the EPA database. And so we will still encourage people to do that when they're implementing these systems, but I think that's the primary kind of requirement that they have. But we'll work within the framework, and they do still technically have some authority over that, which is part of the complicating factors of the regulatory landscape for these projects.
Great. I missed the early part of this presentation. What is the timeline for this policy to take into effect, and how will this align with municipal regional permits, as these will come up for renewal in the next couple of years? Yeah, so we hope to have a draft out, a draft out of this policy for public comment and potentially for scientific peer review by the end of 2025. The timeline as to kind of when it will take effect depends on, I think, how many comments we get and how quickly we can go up for adoption. And then from there, it will likely be pulled into municipal regional permits as they come up for renewal. And so there are some that are up for renewal right now, in which case we might miss that window. We can work with the regional boards on how to maybe incorporate into other ways. But then, you know, in theory, the municipal permits get renewed every 5 years, and so the policy would be incorporated into the next municipal renewal. What level of effort are you considering for monitoring? So that's really dependent on the risk level of the infiltration system. And as Kelly described earlier, you know, we're kind of developing this risk-based framework. So each infiltration system, you know, depending on the land use and some other factors, might fall into different risk levels. If a infiltration system pops into a high risk level, but that permittee still wants to install that system, then we might ask for monitoring associated with that infiltration system. And so again, depending on the risk level, it might be just monitoring the influent stormwater. It might be monitoring down gradient groundwater. It's really, I think it depends on the risk level, like I said. And again, we're still working out all of these answers. So I appreciate all these questions. Looks like we are all out.
I can post that. We have one last poll.
One last poll. Go for it, Shalini. While I'm closing up and waiting for anyone to think of their last questions, their last comments.
Oh, I guess it doesn't have. So the question for each of those is how risky do you think the given land use is? And then you pick the land use that you think the risk that you think that particular land use is for infiltration.
Feel free to fill in that poll as we're finishing up, but I again want to reiterate what Kelly said before. Thank you so much for spending your Monday evening with us and participating in this presentation and answering all these or asking these great questions and providing these great comments. And we will again, if you'd like to hear all this again, we've got another one with all of the same material on Thursday. But go ahead and tell your friends and neighbors if you found this interesting. And keep in touch. Feel free to email us at storms@waterboards.ca.gov and sign up for our email list, and look forward to working with you